How's it going, guys? Welcome back to another video. So this is the third video in my Python mini series where I cover the basics for you to start making your own code. In the previous video we covered the types of data you can store, print statements, math functions, comparison statements, and comments. In this video we'll cover variables, user inputs, and if statements. Also, at the end of the video I'll have a challenge so you can practice what I've covered throughout the next couple of minutes. So now, I'm gonna stop rambling and get on with it. So the first thing we're gonna cover today are variables. So what are variables before we start? Variables are simply something you're gonna store. It could be a number, it could be a string, it could be a float, or other types of data, which you'll most likely use later on for whatever your code's purpose is. So before we start defining variables, you have to know some rules. When you name a variable, you can't use any symbols other than the underscore. Also, you can't use spaces, and you can't start with a number. For these symbols, it is recommended not to start with the underscore. That is normally used as a replacement for the space, since you can't use space. So, let's start defining variables. When you define a variable, you can use basically any name you want. So you can see here, you have example 1, which stores value 1, example 2, which stores value 2, and example 3, which stores value 3. Here we have more examples where I'm storing strings, floats, booleans, functions, and then you can even use other functions or other defined variables to create a new variable. So for instance here, if I were to print out example 5, you'll see that you're gonna print out 5 instead of the name example 5. Here, if I print out example 7, not in strings, you can see I print out 5 and 3. And now let's say I print out example 8. You can see that I get 8 because it adds example 5, which is equal to 5, and example 7, which is equal, well, this is equal to 3 at the end. So you can see here I already had an example of this printing out, so I'll just do it one more time. You have these variables, each with different values, and then the variable called equation, which is number 1 and number 2 added, divided by number 3. So here would be 8 divided by 2, which would be equal to 4. So if we run it, you can see you get 4.0. The 4.0 is because when you divide, you're gonna get a float number. Also, there are different and more easy ways to change a variable. So for instance, you start with a variable called example number 1, and when you print it out you get a 5, right? So let's say you want to add 1 to that variable, but you don't want to type the whole thing, which is xnum equals xnum plus 1. What you can do instead is put the name of the variable and then put plus equal and then whatever value you want to add. So if I were to uncomment this and run it, you can see you're gonna get 6, and this can be whatever value you want. So if I were to change it to 3, you can see it would change to 8. This also applies to other math functions. So subtraction is the same thing. So 5 plus 1, which is equals to 6, and then you subtract 3, which is 3. It also applies to multiplication and division. So we were in 3, then we multiply by 4, you get 12, and then you divide by 0.5, which is the same as multiplying by 2, and you get 24.0 because this is division. Now let's cover inputs. So inputs are a great way to communicate with the user. Now you're gonna have interaction, so the user will be able to manipulate your code. So inputs, for you to ask the user for an input, you're gonna define a variable, then you're gonna type input, and inside of parentheses you're gonna ask whatever question you want. So in this case, let's say you're asking for the user's age, right? So when you run it, it's gonna ask enter your age, and then the user is gonna type whatever they want, right? So let's say they type 90, and then when the user types whatever they typed, this variable is going to save the value that the user entered. Something to take into account is that when the user enters something, this input statement is always going to save it as a string. Saying this, if you want to use this value, let's say 90, in an equation, let's say to add 10 years to that person, you'll need to make it into an integer so you can actually work with that number. To do that, you could either do this, which is the user input equals the integer of the user input, so it converts whatever the user entered into an integer. Or if you want to make it a bit simpler into just one line, you could just make user input equals the integer of the input of this. And then if you run it, then you'll have this number saved as an integer under the name of user input. So for example, if you do this, where you're asking the user for his name as well, you can do enter your age, so let's say 55, and the person's name is Josh. And then you can use that information to display what you want. So here we have user input 2, which is the name of the user, which was Josh. So Josh is, and then the age, which is 55 years old. So like I said before, when a value is entered as an actual number, so let's say as a float or an integer, you can use it to, let's say, add, subtract, divide, multiply, or whatever you want. So you can do something with your code. So it's not just you have one value and you can't change it. So for instance, here we have two inputs, one for the number 1 and then the second for number 2. And what we want to do with this program is do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and squaring using these two values. So let's say here we have the float of the first number and then the float of the second number. So if we run it, the user can enter, let's say 23.5 as the first number, and then 4 as the second number. And then when these two numbers are entered, all of these equations will run. So calcnum1 plus calcnum2, which would be 23.5 plus 4. And then it will get saved under addition and then you can display it as addition of these numbers are 27.5. Same thing applies for subtraction, multiplication, division, and squaring. And obviously you can also use it for many other things. So let's say you want to create a new variable saying division of add. So let's say it's addition divided by division, and then you can print this value is, and you can put division of add, and when you run it, let's say we have different values, so 45 and 1.2, and then you'll have 1.232. So the last thing I'm covering for this video are if statements. If statements are the start of actual algorithms that we'll start making in this Python course. Believe me when I say this is when the fun starts to happen, because you get to use the values you get and do different things with those values without having to manually check and do them. So how do if statements work? If statements, to create an if statement, you just need to have the word if and then a statement next to it. So for this to happen, this statement next to the if needs to be true. If it's not true, you can continue on to the elif statement, which is saying, so if this doesn't happen, then you can go to elif and check if this happens. If this doesn't happen, then you go to the else statement. So one thing to take into account is that the if statement is always going to start a sequence of that same statement. So you can't have more than one if in just one statement. However, with the elif statements, you can have as many as you want. So this is what makes it have infinite amount of possibilities based on your code. And then the else statement is simply if none of these things above the else happen, then do this. So let's start off with this example. Here we have an input for the user, right? So the purpose of this code is to check if the value of this input is positive or negative, and whether it's even or not if it is positive. So let's say the user enters number 4. What the program does is check first the value 4, which is this variable, if it's greater than 0, so if it's positive. Since it is, it then goes to print this out, saying thank you for entering a positive number, which is here. And then it goes on to the next if statement, which is nested inside this one. This one is saying to do this equation, so basically checking if there are any remainders. And if it's equal to 0, it'll always be an even number. So if this value is even, then print the number is even. Else, since there are only even or odd numbers, we can just use else, then print the number is odd. So let's say we run this again, and we put a positive odd number and run it. It's gonna print out the number is odd. So let's say the user, instead of entering a positive value, were to enter a negative value, so -2. Here it's gonna check if the number entered by the user is negative. So since the value is less than 0, it's going to ignore all of this and go into the elif statement right below it. Then it's gonna check if the value is less than 0. Since it is, it's gonna print out you entered an invalid number because it's negative. So now let's see what happens if we enter exactly 0. It's gonna print out you entered 0, which is invalid. What it does is it checks if it's greater than 0. It's not because it is 0. So it goes into the elif statement and it's checking if it's less than 0. Once again, it's not because it is 0. So finally it goes into the else statement, which is everything else that could happen, and it prints out this message, which is you entered 0, which is invalid. Now that we've gone over all of these things, I'm gonna put a challenge for you to do. This challenge I'll go over in the next video, so you can check where you did it right or wrong. By the way, you can do it in different ways and get the same result, so don't worry if it's not exactly the same. And you're gonna apply the things you saw in this video and the previous video. So what you want to do, you're gonna see here on the right, you're gonna ask the user to enter two numbers. The first number, you can enter whatever number you want, so let's say 30. And then the second number, any number you want, again. And let's say for this example, 25. And then what you're gonna do is get the result of the addition, subtraction, multiplication, division of those two numbers. And then you'll check whether the first number or the second number was bigger and print that out. So let's say in this case the first number is bigger because 30 is above 25. And then you'll say if the bigger number, so the number you just checked, is even or it's odd. If it's even, you'll say the bigger number, which is whatever, is even. And if it's odd, you're gonna say the same, except here it'll be odd. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching once again. I hope you liked this video. If you did like it, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content and the answer for this challenge. And also leave a like if you liked the video, which would be greatly helpful for the YouTube algorithm. Also, if you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comment section and I'll try to answer them as soon as possible. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.